Here's my question to you. Has the media been punked by the right? I mean, did conservatives essentially generate a controversy where there was none? Because I am now beginning to think that was the case. And I am someone who on this program thought this is a very important issue. It seems there's this distance. And now I really don't know what to believe. Guide me.
I don't think it is. I think it's fantastical to think that a video caused this. And I think that the administration...
But the people on the ground are saying that.
But at the end of the day, what are they protesting? They are storming an American consulate. It is about American policy.
Well, no, but
a policy that they do, that they are protesting against, that they don't like. And we should have had a fortified defense, and Obama should have taken responsibility. But the whole problem, Obama had a chance to show presidential leadership in the 48-hour period after Romney also both abysmally failed.
But wait a second. That seems to me projecting onto, and I'm not saying that, you know, obviously there is... I think one of the things that's been confusing about this story, right, is that we want to identify some cause, right? And that all stories must be mutually exclusive with each other. Either it was the video, or it was Ansar al-Sharia, or it was al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or it was premeditated, right? All of those things can be true concurrent. So
right.
That's part of the problem, right?
It's a premeditated attack in reaction to the video.
Right, exactly.
By probably not al-Qaeda.
Right, but also by protesters who happen to be around with guns because the country is awash in guns. But I just want to respond one thing to this about it being American policy. I mean, I think at a certain level you have to take somewhat at face value what the people who pulled off the operation are saying. I mean, if they say, we were doing this because of the video, I'm inclined to believe them. When Osama bin Laden said why he did 9/11, I'm inclined to believe that's why he did 9/11. We don't want the American troops in Saudi Arabia occupying the Holy Land or whatever. We're not going to project onto these folks what we think their motives were.
But
right?
to Lisa's point, I think there's two separate issues here. I think on the security issue,
right,
there's more than enough evidence to say that the administration did not handle this well. When you have a request come in for more security, whether it would have made a difference or not, after the UN office, the Red Cross office, the British ambassador, all been attacked in the embassy, a hole had been blown in the wall of that compound, our consulate earlier. There should be accountability and responsibility by this administration on that. On the second issue, I think when Representative Thornberry, a Republican, on the House Intelligence Committee actually says, you know, what the intelligence community was telling us, General Petraeus, is exactly what the administration was putting out to the public. People tend to forget, have worked in the National Security Council, headed Deep Blue, the Navy's anti-terrorism unit, that there are no one-armed intelligence officers. They're always saying on the one hand, but on the other hand. The issue is this. It's hard for this assertion of conspiracy or anything, or to say that policy is unraveling, because intelligence agencies maybe didn't have it right. There is no assertion that can be made of conspiracy by these professionals. That's what's missing in this piece. General Petraeus misrepresenting something? No way.
Elise, you raised, I think, an important and provocative question before we went to break is, are we at war with Libya? I mean, when you say this is an active war, are we at war in Libya? I don't think we're at war with Libya, but are we at war in Libya? And this is kind of a profound definitional question because there was some debate about whether the president had the authority to order the intervention in Libya. There was some noises coming from Congress, although not a particularly strenuous effort to make sure that it didn't happen. And it gets to this point of security, right? I mean, if we get off this sort of what happened when timeline, and I think we're maybe at consensus at the table that there are a bunch of facts stacked atop each other which are not mutually exclusive, and that accounts for some of the confusion, right, in the initial reports. In terms of diplomatic security, Ali, you were making a point during the break about private security contractors and the role that they had filled in previously in our long era of intervention in that region.
Yeah, so well, the thing about Libya is that Libya was not classified by the State Department as a war zone. And you can make whatever you want as that. I mean, it basically is a conflict zone because there are weapons around. Elise is right about that.
Tons of weapons.
But that's kind of how Libya is going to be for the next 100 years, right? 50, 100 years. So
bold prediction. Continue.
Libya is a conflict zone. I mean, that place is flooded with weapons. And then in the previous model, in these other places that were considered war zones, you had the super beefed up security with Blackwater private security contractors. These guys ran around. There was the Nisour Square massacre in Iraq. They killed a bunch of people. And now governments like Libya's new government don't want us to put these mercenary armies on the ground there. They consider that boots on the ground just the same as if they were U.S. Marines. And in fact, it's actually worse than U.S. Marines because there's no accountability for those people, as we saw from Blackwater's activities in the bushes. There's no accountability to anyone. I mean, they do protect their charges. This is a point Elise made during the break, which is true. And it creates a conundrum for us because how do you protect people without those? We used to have the Diplomatic Security Service, which its sole job, I mean, the whole point of bolstering that service would be so that we could say to governments like that in Libya that, hey, we have a group of accountable American government employees
who are in the American chain of command,
whose sole job is to protect our diplomats abroad. But we've gutted that in favor of outsourcing it and having these unaccountable mercenaries.
But the real question, we've also cut the budget for it dramatically. We have diplomatic security, and they're extremely good. In fact, many diplomats complain all the time that they're too well protected. They can't do their jobs.
We've talked about that on the show.
Indeed, Ambassador Stevens wanted to be out there, but we've cut the budget. We've gutted the budget for the State Department as a whole.
You're absolutely right, Amory. It's been cut 10% since 2010. But the real issue is, what are the implications for the Arab Spring and for our positions there in Libya and Northern Africa? Are we headed in the general direction? And my argument is, yes, overall. We've established an AFRICOM, a military command over Africa, with more drones just being requested for that. It's not that we're at war in the right direction. That does not sound it is, because we're understanding that Al-Qaeda has metastasized to some degree, because 2/3 of Al-Qaeda's leadership had been decimated in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The issue is, however, when you look at Libya itself, and understand that on the proportional representation in its recent legislature elections, the majority of those 100 that were elected were moderates or secular. Is it going to be spotty security? Is it going to be rough going? Absolutely. But as you look a little bit more towards the east and see that Morsi then went to Iran and said, hey, wait a moment. I may not always agree with the United States, but stop building a nuclear weapon. And number two, what's happening in Syria is outrageous. You begin to say, maybe we have an Egyptian Islamic government and a Turkish Islamic government that can begin becoming strong bulwarks of owning the suitcase of problems more in the Arab world. And that can help us. So are we in the general right direction? Yeah. Is it going to be spotty? Yes. But so has it been in the past when 12 of our embassies were attacked during the Bush years and a diplomat was killed in Pakistan.
The case that the Romney Ryan ticket is making, which is to use the example of what happened with the attack in the Benghazi consulate as this data point in a broader argument about the unraveling of the American foreign policy. Here's Vice Presidential candidate Paul Ryan making that case.
The Benghazi thing would be a tragedy in and of itself if it was an isolated incident. The problem is it's not simply an isolated incident, but a picture of a broader story of the absolute unraveling of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Go around the world and you see policy failure after policy failure, and that is something that they just can't defend.
That is the case in the Republicans, that this is part of the tragedy in Benghazi indicates some broader failure in the Middle East.
Well, I think there are a lot of problems clearly today in the Middle East. Your question of weapons of mass destruction. Now, I just do not get why we intervened in Libya if we are trying to convince people to see their weapons of mass destruction. If you're the Iranians and you see we actually go in and intervene once you do give away your weapons of mass destruction, what incentive do you have?
I think that's an interesting provocative point, but let me just set the context for viewers who are not familiar with this, right? Of course, Gaddafi had a nuclear weapons program, and one of the big victories that was announced during the Bush administration, which they chalked up to the Iraq intervention, but I think was absolutely not the case. It was a lot of diplomacy actually by the EU, convinced Gaddafi to give up his nuclear weapons. He gave up his nuclear weapons, and there is a case to be made that what he did was he gave up his nuclear program, and a few years later, there were NATO bombs essentially deposing, and that essentially is a bad nuclear non-proliferation.
Yeah, but to my point, I was actually not in support of the Libya intervention, first off. But that said, this unraveling issue kind of is amazing to me. I mean, here we are, having stopped this tragic war in Iraq, where our army could not respond to any other war plan throughout all of the world to defend South Korea, by testimony of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, because they've done nothing but counterinsurgency training, to where a 4-star Marine Corps general said it's going to take us 10 years before we're ready to be back to handling all the combined arms around the world. Third, to have had a shift of our focus to the Western Pacific, to where our naval forces by this president are now 60% of our arms. Marines down in Australia. If you're a Democrat, some of them would now be saying, if it was a Republican president doing that, are you a warmonger? No, I don't think this is unraveling. This is beginning to stitch back the strength of the entire fabric of our national security.
This just sounds like hold on thought for a second. We just got to take a quick break. Come back to you after the break. This is in real dollars, not nominal dollars, which means there are in nominal dollars, which means in the actual price tag that's on the budget, they go up every year to keep pace with inflation. So that leveling is an actual leveling in real dollars.
You know, there's actually, nobody wants a stronger defense than I do. I mean, 31 years in the United States military, you want your soldiers to go over there and come back, having accomplished the missions and the tools they need. But that said, to Larry's point, two other things have changed. Our capability within one ship alone is so much more. An aircraft carrier today can do 9 times the strikes in 24 hours, 9 times the targets in 24 hours than that same aircraft carrier could do just 15 years ago. Because the new domain of warfare is knowledge, the ability to have satellites pick up where the adversary is and link it real time to our aircraft going on. So therefore, it's not how many ships, how many fighter aircraft we have, it's capability with the knowledge. Number 2 is accountability. Everyone wants accountability in our spending. But take that aircraft carrier.
If I might object, not everyone wants accountability in our spending, particularly in our security spending. There is an industry of contractors that would very much, thank you very much, not like to have accountability.
Let's just say that the people in Elks County and Pennsylvania want it. And so therefore, when you see that in that aircraft carrier that was asked for a few years ago of $11 billion, that the confidence factor that that price was right on internal Navy documents was about 35%. Would you buy a car if the car dealer said the price you're going to pay for that car next year is roughly a third of what I'm going to tell you, and you just pay me next year? In short, that's why we have cost overruns 2008 of $300 billion, because we have this tyranny of optimism. The price that we give forward is going to be right. We need accountability.
But of course, the argument on the other side, and this is the arguments made all the time, is that there are jobs attached to every one cost overruns. There's someone building those things. And I want to show an ad Mitt Romney is running, because this is where he thinks he's on strongest footing in weighting this politically when we come back.
This president can ask us to be patient. This president can tell us it was someone else's fault. But this president cannot tell us that you're better off today than when he took office.
Here in Colorado, we're not better off under President Obama. His defense cuts will weaken national security and threaten nearly 20,000 jobs. Romney's plan? Reverse Obama defense cuts, strengthen our military, and create over 200,000 new jobs for Colorado.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
Some good old-fashioned military Keynesianism from Mitt Romney. Government spending does not create jobs.
Rolling it over in his grave, listening to those things.
Yeah, I mean, this has obviously been the standard Republican line, you know, forever, which is that government can't create jobs except if government jobs are defense-related. Emory, my sense is that you're supportive of the basic concept of the Obama trajectory for defense spending.
Absolutely. And I mean, I actually am not in support of sequestration and simply cutting $50 billion across the top. I mean, I think we actually need to figure out what the threats are and relate our spending to the threats. But that said, you know, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullins, said back in 2009 that the deficit was the greatest threat to our national security, that we needed to rebuild our strength at home. We needed to rebuild our health and our education and our infrastructure. And that's part of what we need to be strong in the world. And the other part, going back to our discussion on Libya, $50 billion is the entire budget for the State Department, pretty much.
Yeah.
Right? We need more diplomats. We need more development. We need more of all the other kinds of ways in which we advance America's interests in the world. And the Pentagon actually understands that. When you look at what we needed in Afghanistan, it's not more soldiers. It's more of the rest of our security.
Because that way you can. I'm sorry.
So, Nolly, I'm curious if you think that the Obama trajectory is aggressive enough.
Well, look, when you compare Obama to Romney, he comes out looking like a peacenik. But if you look at Obama in absolute terms, it's true that he wants to fight leaner wars. He wants a leaner military, but that's because drones are cheaper, more efficient. And is that what we want? I mean, what do ordinary Americans want? Most Americans are sick of war. Most Americans want international cooperation. So I agree with Anne-Marie about diplomacy being important, although in the past U.S. diplomacy has been more of a sledgehammer rather than a velvet glove.
We'll talk about that next.
But I think it is really important that when we look at Obama and his trimming of the military budget, it's not because it's not going to lead to us fighting fewer wars necessarily. It may mean fewer boots on the ground, and that's good for Americans not losing lives, but it's not going to mean fewer other lives being lost, because we're going to be, he wants to invest more in drones. He has expanded the drone war far beyond Bush. This is not a president, this is a president president who sees American interests and goes after them. He may not want to get involved in wars that he doesn't see American interests in directly, but it doesn't mean that he is a peace president. He never has been, and he won't be.
You know, it's interesting. After every buildup, when I worked for Reagan, we went up for 4 years by 28% in real terms. Then we had a deficit problem. We came down 10% in real terms over 4 years. Sequestration is only 8% reduction from where you are.
Right. And if people are running around Capitol Hill like it's the end of the American project.
It's going to make us not the strongest nation.
And if you go back and you take a look, as Mark Shields calls him, our last liberal president, Richard Nixon, he cut 30% in 4 years. 30% in real terms. And he started EPA and OSHA and all the other things Republicans are complaining about. And going back to the point Dan Marie said, Admiral Mullen, Secretary Gates said, well, deficit's a big problem. We need to spend more on state. But when you ask them, you want to take it from defense? Oh, no, we don't want to cut. And that's what we need. We need a unified national security budget that looks at state, homeland security, and defense and make those trade-offs.
Those other elements of our power can actually prevent
war.
But the point is, it would be a real shame to say that we are going to continue to build or retake, as Romney wants to, an F-22 that's not needed because of a job. Because that's not what the warrior out there wants to hear. And when you really look at his numbers, Chris, they're really something. There's 3.5 million jobs in the defense and aerospace industry. According to what Mr. Romney is saying, this 10% cut in our defense budget, even if you do sequestration, would mean you lose 40% of all those jobs. That's ridiculous. And so the numbers don't even add up.
Well, you know, when the defense spending went up in the last 5 years before you had the Budget Control Act, these companies were laying off people.
Right.
They had less. And if you take $1 and you say, I'm going to spend that on defense, education, health, or even a tax cut, you create more jobs.
Well, that's part of the issue. We actually talked about this in mining yesterday, right? A lot of this defense spending is incredibly capital-intensive undertaking as opposed to labor-intensive, right? If you spend $1, right, it depends on where you put that dollar. If it's a very capital-intensive industry, a very labor-intensive industry, things like healthcare and education are very labor-intensive. Things like building nuclear submarines is very capital-intensive. And so, in terms of the job creation potential per bang of buck,
healthcare.
One of the things that's fascinating. Is that American public opinion on this has fluctuated more than I thought it would. I want to show you some of the data on that when we get back. So, having come of age post 9/11 as an adult and as a reporter, I think I had come under the impression that the sacredness, the sanctity of the defense budget was a fixture in American politics. But actually, this polling I thought was really interesting. This is basically U.S. views on defense spending, and from 1969 to 2012, and they're actually quite volatile. So during certain periods, you see us saying we're spending too much. For instance, in the post-Reagan buildup, and then what happens is the policy seems to adjust. We spend too much. There were defense cuts towards the latter part of the Reagan years. There's the Cold War dividend that we take, and then you see we're spending too little after 9/11, and now we're back to spending too much. And to hit this point home, take a look at this moment that our second producer, Sal Gentile, found from the 2000 debate between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Take a look.
I propose $100 billion for this purpose. The governor proposes $45 billion. I propose more than twice as much because I think it's needed.
Governor Bush, 2 minutes.
If this were a spending contest, I'd come in second. I readily admit I'm not going to grow the size of the federal government like he is. I'm concerned that we're over-deployed around the world. Spending money is one thing, but spending money without a strategic plan can oftentimes be wasted.
The subject there was defense spending specifically, and remarkably, that Al Gore was to the right of George W. Bush. George W. Bush was attacking his opponent for wanting to spend too much money on defense, and that. I guess the point there is that there is much more. The American public is more malleable and more persuadable, I think, on this than I would have guessed.
But also, what George Bush said is strategic planning. We do not have the new strategic approach. What is our strategy for the future? Since Colin Powell's days, the early 90s, it used to be based on the defense of the two most stressing scenarios we had: Iraq, which is now gone, and the defense of South Korea, where the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff says we don't need the Army to defend South Korea anymore. So what are we measuring our military towards? Okay, we got some concerns about China that's coming onto the world scene and claiming East and the South China Sea are its inland waterways almost. And there's terrorism. But our defense, quadrennial defense review still says two stressing scenarios. We don't have a name for them, so we're still building two militaries for two major regional conflicts.
And
we don't have the right strategy.
We have essentially plugged into that same budget a generic conflict.
Just last year was that decision.
You know, I think what's happening here is the Republicans are trying to find some way in which they can find a context to say we want to create jobs.
Yes, that's true.
They don't want to do it through government, but of course, as you said earlier, the military is considered separate from government. It was interesting to hear George W. Bush be more of a classic conservative, saying that government spending, I don't want to increase the size of government. Romney seems to have no problem with increasing the size of government when it comes to the military, but I think, again, it's this issue of jobs, because that's what Americans want to hear.
Right.
He's going to be bringing that up on Monday as well, because people's eyes will glaze over when we talk about conflicts very far away in the world that don't seem to concern their own lives. He's going to try to hit it home with the issue of jobs.
And it's particularly, we should note, it's particularly important in swing states, right? I mean,
absolutely.
In some ways, the whole thing might just be about Virginia, which a huge amount of the Virginia economy revolves around both the defense contractors and the
if Obama's smart, he'll expose that.
You know why George Bush was talking about cutting defense spending? The point that the Admiral made earlier. He said technology is going to substitute for this. He had what they call the revolution in military.
This is the Rumsfeld vision.
Yeah, and basically he was arguing that the Democrats had not, not supported that. And I think that's what people, forget. And of course, after 9/11, they forgot everything and just, as Bob Gates said, opened up the spigots of, defense spending.
Here's the thing. I think that the broader point, and I was looking at the chart, which you don't have of in real dollars, not as a percentage of GDP, but in real dollars, how our security spending happened. Huge bump for the Cold War. It came down a bit, but that actually created a new baseline, and now we've added the war on terror atop that. And so now we have these two bumps sitting against each other. And the point is, we need to reassess. We can't keep building security architecture on top of each other and actually go back and deconstruct the old security architecture.
Particularly when you're building on force structure, not capability in the knowledge domain.
I want to thank Larry Korb of the Center for American Progress and former Congressman Joe Sestak for joining us this morning. It's a great pleasure.